colleagues, long-standing friends, some of you are new partners. It's really a pleasure to have everyone connected today. We have a small number of people here in the room, but a really very large number of people connected online. So thank you all for taking the time to come and join us today for this session, Pushing the Limits, Strengthening Synergies Between Citizen Data, AI, and Official Statistics. This session is only 90 minutes long, and that's really barely enough for me to even read out this enormous title, let alone tackle the huge multitude of topics that we've tried to squeeze into it. We've posed some really big questions for this session, and we already know that we're barely going to scratch the surface of all of them today. So our sincere hope is that this session today is the start of an enduring journey for which many of you will join us as we try to find innovative ways to strengthen the field of human rights measurement, bolstering the role of human rights in official statistics, and testing the boundaries of what can be measured, how it gets measured, who collects or generates data, and how those data are used. Let me start with just a few bits of housekeeping. As you all have noticed, this event is running as a Teams webinar in hybrid format. So we have some people in the room, many of you online. This is the first time we've used Teams webinars, and we're still getting familiar with it. So please bear with us if we have any technical challenges. In particular, you'll notice because it's a Teams webinar, there are some limits on how interactive this session can be. So we do have the online participants muted and without your cameras on, unfortunately. If you want to interact with us, we ask you to use the questions and answer session and write your questions in that function. If time permits towards the end, we may be able to allow people to raise their hands and manually allow some people to speak, but we'll have to see when we get there after the presentations. I will just mention that as part of this session, we will be doing some online polls using Slido. As a statistician, I have to admit that they will be very unscientific, but nevertheless, we do invite you to participate in those. So do be ready to use either your phone or enter the details in your browser to participate in those. And we will, of course, be sharing the full slide decks from all the presenters at the end of this session. Just for those in the room, so that we know that you're here, and if you want things to be shared with you, I will just ask you, I'll pass around this piece of paper and ask people to write their name and contact details on there as well. So let's just get started with a little bit of an icebreaker for you to get familiar with the technology that we're going to be using, but also because I think actually the answers to this question are going to be genuinely interesting for this conversation. So you can either scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter this number 1565 487 and just let us know what kind of organization do you represent. Are you joining us today from a national statistical office, a national human rights institution, a civil society organization, or an international organization? And if the latter, is it one with mainly a statistics and data focus or mainly a human rights focus? Or are you joining us from some totally different sort of organization? I'm just going to give people a few seconds to enter their answers there. And I think this is already really interesting to see that a majority of those joining us today are from the human rights or other arena and from international organizations. We don't have so many national statistical offices. We don't have so many national human rights institutions. Please come on in and join us. Excuse me. I think the numbers are not going up so much now, so I will move on. And my second little icebreaker. In one word, what comes to mind when you think about measuring human rights? Don't think about it too much, just fire your thoughts in there. Progress is the first one that comes in. Justice, challenging, complexities, access. Dignity, showing up front and center. That's a great one. Accountability. This is great that people can come up with their one word so quickly, but also really telling, I think, that dignity is showing up front and center in this list. This is just to get you thinking and hopefully leading in to some of the discussion today. So the title of this session is Pushing the Limits. What are we talking about? Whose limits are we interested in? Well, the field of human rights measurement involves a whole lot of different kinds of stakeholders. It involves national statistical offices, civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, and many more. And we know that human rights metrics are essential human rights tools, but we also know that there's a range of barriers that can get in the way of producing these kind of metrics. We're going to hear about some of those from today's presenters. Absent or fragmented data, lack of agreed methodologies, NSOs whose mandates are limited, maybe there's curtailment of political independence that makes it difficult for them to produce the statistics that can really be believed. But there is hope, and that's why we're here. This is called a solutions roundtable. We want to hear about some of these solutions. We want to hear about partnerships that reach beyond the traditional confines of official statistics. We know that these are conversations that are going on within the statistics community much more broadly. We know that the whole topic of citizen data, for example, is a massive conversation, and I know that many of the people connected today are involved in that conversation. So this is not to repeat all of that material, but to bring the focus specifically onto human rights. We want to look at situations where the things we want to measure are specifically to do with the enjoyment or violation of human rights, and where the approaches that we want to foster have a human rights-based approach at their center. So without further ado, we're going to introduce our speakers. We're going to have a slight change of order from what was announced on the schedule, but we are going to hear from a representative of official statistics, so national statistical offices. That is going to be Piedad Urdinola, who is the director of DANE, the National Statistical Institute of Colombia. We're going to hear from representatives of two different civil society organizations. Maria Gargiulo, who's sitting opposite me here in the room. She's a statistician at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And Annie Namala, who is joining us online. She's the executive director for the Center for Social Equity and Inclusion in India. And then finally, we're going to hear from a representative of a national human rights institution, Samson Omondi, who is the assistant director of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. I'm going to hand over first to Annie. I'm not going to give a full bio for each of these presenters, but you can find them on the webinar details page online. So, and I think, unfortunately, we have some problems with sharing slides from the presenters' point of view. So I'm going to get Annie's slides online, and Annie, you can tell me when you see them, and then you can tell me when you need me to move on to the next slide. So Annie's slides are here, and Annie, the floor is yours.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
We hear you well.
Thank you, Fiona, and all friends. It's really a privilege to be here speaking on this particular day of the Human Rights Day. And I really look forward to a very interesting and engaging conversation. So, as Fiona said, I work with a civil society organization called Center for Social Equity and Inclusion, but also very closely associated with the national campaign, which means Do Not Break Your Promises. Today, what I would be sharing with you is about how certain very invisible small communities in India who are called the denotified and nomadic tribes in India, how we've been able to bring some level of visibility and some data points on these communities through a community-based process, and how that has made it possible for these communities to have a little bit of a voice in the kind of larger social polity in India. So maybe to the next slide, Fiona. So if you would look at India and our independence in 1947, we inherited a highly fragmented, structured, hierarchical society, which was fragmented on levels of caste, gender, tribe, and various other disadvantaged or what we call our historically marginalized communities. Fortunately, at the time of independence, there were advocates from many of these communities who spoke on behalf of those communities and got special protection and provision for these communities. The nomadic communities, if you see the two photographs, these are photographs right from 2024-25. You would see the photo on the top shows you a community member, a family that has come to the urban area in terms of migrant labor. And that's the kind of situation they live in today. And if you look at the picture below, that's a woman standing in front of her home in their native village. So it is an extremely marginalized kind of life that they live. And unfortunately, they did not have any great voice at the time of independence to bring them special provisions, and they continue to be among the most marginalized communities. It's expected that they are around 10% of India's population, which is about 140 million people. And later, the government reports have continuously showed them to be the poorest among the poorest in the Indian context. So that is a missing category in inclusion, as we call it. And we've used citizen data to really highlight their situation and bring some voice to the community. The next one, Fiona. But this community was not always like this. They were a highly valued, relevant community in olden times when they were traders, animal herders, they were weapon makers, they were artisans, cultural artists. So they did have a very rich cultural heritage. Which, if you would see the picture there, it is really our first prime minister who's talking with some of these communities in front of a fort, and it is believed that they were part of the art, weaponry makers of that fort. So they did have a very important role in early economy of India, but later after the independence, their their relevance, their ability to continue in the economy has really gone down a lot. The next one. The next slide, yeah. So this data, what we looked at was, we using citizen data, what we do is try to get data from 100 or multiples of 100 households to make it a statistically relevant data and compare their provisions and their situation with the rest of India. So if you would look at, this was a study we did of about 400 households in one state of India of the denotified communities. And if you would see in this community, about 74% of the population were non-literates in the adult group. And if you look at housing provisions, you also saw in the picture how housing has been a huge challenge for this community. Those who have permanent housing in this community is just about 15%. The large majority, 85% of them, do not have a permanent housing structure. So if you take the next slide. So this household survey of 400, what we did is we engaged community volunteers to do the data collection. And what the community volunteers told us was that we always knew our community was poor, but never realized how poor it was. And I think that is the beauty of citizen data, where we are able to help members of the community to do the data collection, to co-analyze the data so that they understand the status of the community. So if you look at, it really shows the kind of data collection that happened. And the volunteers themselves then took it to the community, to the local government, to raise issues for themselves, and were able to hold meetings with the administration, were able to invite the administration to their hamlets, and also they could get some of the social protection measures for about 150 plus households. So what we realized is that along with citizen data, you also need to ensure that some of the key challenges that these communities are facing has a way forward for the members of the community. The next one. So citizen data, what we have found, it has a lot of value when we make it a community-driven participatory methodology. So even in coming up with the questions that we want to ask the community, there are issues that need to be prioritized as per the community's priority. When we do data collection with community volunteers, it really adds to the knowledge of the volunteers and the community. And very often, because there is a challenge in language, there is a challenge in context, to make sense of some of this data, we need to sit down with the community volunteers to analyze the data. And community ability to get some of the social protection measures that they have been looking for, engage with the government, think that becomes an add-on point for the community data-driven process, where not only is information gathered, but also access to some of the provisions and mobilization of the community is a second dimension that you can look at. Next one. So what are the challenges? When we do citizen data, we usually do it for extremely marginalized communities. And the nomadic communities are among the most marginalized. They are small, dispersed. So migration is, a huge process in this community. And so it means really getting into the language of the community, getting into volunteers who can stay with you for a process of data collection, and ensuring that they are able to at least get certain legal documents and provisions that they are looking for. So I think these are the challenges that we try to address through citizen data and a community mobilization process. The next. So lessons forward, what we found when we did citizen data is because of the huge diversity in context and languages, you really need to engage community volunteers and community leaders to gather your data, to follow up the processes, and also then connect them to larger processes of the government and the society at large. So this is two benefits that you get from doing community data with the community, citizen data with the community. Next one. So a wider impact, because this was a large network, what we could also do is we could get this community recognized as one of the marginalized community in the VNR report. And then we also were able to have follow-up conversations with members of the community. And in 2027 census, which is going to be an important census for India, we've decided that we would go on a campaign to ensure that members of this community are included in the census data. And this wider impact also comes because we have a larger network of marginalized communities, and the DNT community has now become one of the members of this network. Next, I think that should be the last. Yeah. So I would stop here. So my plea here is to use citizen data to make visible marginalized communities and how their agenda can be brought to the forefront. Thank you.
Annie, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation and really inspiring. We're going to keep questions until the end. So we're going to move straight on to our next presenter, which is Maria from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. Maria is in the room with us and is going to share her own slides. So bear with us just a moment while we organize that. And then when you're ready, Maria, the floor will be yours.
We just have to look at the online version.
Yeah. Okay, so I think for those in the room, I think my slides aren't going to show on that screen. So I think there are some online versions maybe open. Maybe they'll start cooperating. But happy Human Rights Day to everyone online and in person. And thanks for having me here today. I am going to start with a little introduction to the organization I work for, the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, which I'll refer to as HRDAG by our initials throughout this presentation. And we are a small, nonprofit, nonpartisan human rights organization based in San Francisco in the US. I'm based in the UK. The rest of our team is in the US. And we are a team of statisticians, data scientists, demographers, computer scientists who use scientific methods to answer key questions of facts about human rights violations with partners both in the US and abroad. We have done this work for over 30 years. I think this will be our 35th year in 2026. And we have worked with a variety of partners, both big and small. So small grassroots organizations, including local organizations up to large organizations like OHCHR and other UN bodies to do this work in a variety of contexts across the globe. And today I'm going to talk about a project that we did between 2020 and 2022 with the Colombian Truth Commission and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And whenever I talk about this project, I think it's really important to start with the acknowledgements for this project, because while I'm here today presenting it to you, this project was a labor of love of many, many people at both institutions in Colombia, and we received generous funding from a consortium of European governments that really made this project possible. And to date, and I say this sort of part being proud, but also part being profoundly sad, this is the largest human rights data project to date. The proud part of me says this team was able to accomplish all of that. But the sad part is it speaks to the magnitude of suffering that Colombia has faced during their armed conflict. And I just want to hold space for both of those feelings. So I want to start by just telling you a bit about the project. So as I told you, this was a collaborative project that took place between 2020 and 2022. And we had sort of four main objectives. So the first was to integrate information from a variety of databases that we received about human rights violations. And today, when I use the term database, what I want you to imagine is sort of a list of victims. So each row represents a person's story. Our second objective was to address missing data that was impacting our data sources. The third was to design statistical analyses of 5 human rights violations. And the final, and I will argue, most important part of our project was to build statistical capacity within Colombian human rights organizations. I want to just start by telling you a little bit more about the data we received for our project. So we received 112 different databases from 44 different sources. These different sources included state entities, civil society organizations, and victims collectives. Again, sort of organizations at every level we can imagine. The data was all in different formats. Each organization keeps data according to the formats that work most for them, and it's our job to adapt our workflow to that. And we primarily focused on sociodemographic information about victims, so things like their age, their sex, their ethnicity, contextual information about the violence occurred, so what type of violation was it, when and where did it happen, and finally, some very basic information about the presumed perpetrator, so just broadly, what group were they from. In total, we received almost 13 million records of victims of displacement, disappearance, homicide, kidnapping, and recruitment, with the minimum information we deemed necessary for the analysis. And while we received all of this data, the problem is data quality. Even after receiving all of this data, we still have profound questions about data quality. And whenever I talk about data quality in conflict settings, I really want to underscore that this documentation work is of low quality by statistical standards, because documenting human rights violations is really difficult and it can be very dangerous. And as a result of those impossible circumstances that I'm always amazed that anything gets documented and preserved at all, the data that results is usually not complete, and it's usually not representative when we say that word statistically. Some victims are never documented. When we do document victims, we are frequently missing information. And finally, different sources tend to disagree about both the magnitude and patterns of violence.
And I really want to underscore that while I'm talking about data quality challenges, this is not a critique of the data. And this is also not a critique of the organizations doing the data collection. I'm a statistician. This is an empirical reality I need to address in my work. And if I can't do that, that's a me problem. That is not like an inherent deficiency of the information itself. And I'm hoping that some of you have this open online because I have some graphs I would really like you to be able to see. And my first graph is a really common graph I make, which is my different sources, different stories graph. So this takes the colored lines below, and again, I'm sorry it's small if you're looking at the screen, represent the 6 largest data sources documenting, in this case, homicides in the Colombian conflict. And the black line on top represents the total if we aggregated all of those sources and then additional sources not shown here. I want you to take away 2 things from this graph. First is that the different sources tell different stories about the violence. In Colombia, it's very common for people to have their favorite organization that they get data from, and their understanding of the pattern of homicides in conflict comes from that organization. And here we can see, just taking 6 of them, how different that story looks. And the second thing I want you to know or to observe here is this black line is telling us not just that like, oh, each year we should just consider the biggest source, and that is the number we take for the number of homicides, but rather different sources are documenting different populations of victims. It's not just a capacity thing, like, oh, this source one year, they had the most capacity, so they have the no. We needed to integrate data from 44 different sources. We needed to take all that time processing 112 databases because each of them is providing something unique that is not provided by the other sources. I don't think it makes sense to think of human rights violations as something we can document centrally, right? We need to borrow strength from all of the different documentation efforts. How we do that, there's a lot of questions, but the fact that we need to incorporate information from many sources is really not up for debate for me. The second thing I want to show you here, this is now a table, and I have some percentages, is even when we do document things, even if we can get away from this, oh, we have very different narratives of what happened, records are very frequently missing information. So if we just look at disappearance, we have missingness ranging from no records are missing sex, that's great. 70% of records are missing presumed perpetrator. What do we do in this case when we want to do an analysis by perpetrator? This was really important to the Truth Commission to be able to do some comparisons by perpetrator when 70% of the records are missing perpetrator. Do we just throw away 70% of our disappearance records, or do we do something else? And then finally, there are many victims we don't document at all. This graph is again showing victims of homicide, and I'd like you to focus on sort of 2 things here. So this black line here is the black line I showed you before, the number of documented homicides. And this blue range represents the number of homicide victims we estimated, the range being our uncertainty. The gap between the bottom of the uncertainty interval and the black line, that is the underreporting. So that is our sort of minimum estimate of underreporting. What we observe from this is, yes, there's heterogeneity in the underreporting, but there's one thing that's consistent over time, which is that there is underreporting of victims. If we were to just analyze the documented data alone and say the number is X and these are the characteristics of the victims, we'll be certainly misled about the magnitude, but we may also be misled about the trends of violence. So it's really important that we go beyond just citing documented statistics and think really about the data generating process and what that means for what result. Let me see if I'm echoing. Okay, excellent. So I've just told you about challenges that maybe some of them seem scary, and sometimes they are. But we have technical tools that can help us address these challenges. This is why I say it's an empirical reality. We can have solutions. So just talking about those 3 challenges I told us about before, we have many sources that have different stories. We're missing some characteristics of documented records, and some victims are not estimated altogether. We have tools that can help us address that. Just to tell you about them briefly, and we can talk more about them in detail after, but record linkage is the method that allows us to leverage information from multiple sources, and this prevents us from counting individual victims more than once. We also don't want to arbitrarily inflate the data we have. Second, a process called imputation. This is statistical imputation, not judicial imputation. This allows us to probabilistically fill in missing values when we have a documented victim, but say we don't know their age. And finally, a method called multiple systems estimation. It's also called capture-recapture in the ecology literature. That allows us to estimate the size and characteristics of the total victim population, including victims whose stories have not yet been recorded by any of the sources. And the thing I really want to emphasize with this is this workflow I just described to you, these three methods we're using to address different challenges, was developed. I mean, none of these methods are new, but we developed this workflow after we had a deep understanding of both our project objectives and the associated data challenges, right? We chose tools to address our issues. We did not find issues for our tools. And I say this because I think there's been a lot of focus on AI recently that to me seems like a hammer in search of a nail rather than finding the correct hammer to actually hit the nail into the wood. And then I think another thing that we thought about when we did this project is how are we going to build public trust in the results? I told you again, in Colombia, people have a favorite source that has statistics about the conflict. There's a really rich data ecosystem and statistical ecosystem in Colombia for the conflict. How do we build public trust in something that might contradict what people have thought to be true for a long time because something statistically more rigorous has not been available, or because a project like this hasn't existed? We did sort of three main things. So the first is anonymized microdata from this project was actually published by the National Statistics Office in Colombia, in DANE. Second, we developed open source software to facilitate three things. So first, amazingly, the data from this project and many things from the Truth Commission in Colombia were published under Creative Commons licenses, which is amazing from like a sharing standpoint. But it means that people are free to host their own copies of the data, and a malicious actor might change something in the data. So the first set of functionality allows users to verify that the data they're using is the data they intend to use. The second is this software was created to help users replicate results from our project. We thought replication was really important for establishing public trust in what we've done. And third is we also want people to use the published data to design new analyses of the conflict that explore other dimensions that they're interested in and that maybe haven't been explored before. And finally, some colleagues of mine, I participated in this a little, but mainly my colleagues did massive work socializing the results from this project. So we've given in total over 20 presentations to universities, civil society organizations, and government entities online and in person in Colombia and abroad to talk about the project, what we did, the methods we used, and how they can sort of use the data if they like to. And we also routinely do workshops on how to use the data and software from the project. Again, this is part of ensuring public trust, and it also means that people are now using the data from this project, so it's not just stored on a computer somewhere and just sort of sitting there. And I just want to end with sort of three concluding reflections I've been thinking a lot about recently as I've been recounting this project. And the first, especially when we're talking about AI, and I sort of said this before, but I'll say it again, is the importance of having a purposely designed technical workflow, right? Spending time identifying the problems you have and picking the right tools to solve that problem, not just putting AI on something because that is what is currently trendy to do. And the reason we shouldn't do this is not only because, I think from a moral standpoint, we should do things differently, but it's not going to solve the problems you have if it's not the right tool, and it will instead create new ones for you, and no one has time for that. The second thing, which is so important, is the necessity of dedicated staff time for doing technical work. There is no box, there is no button. You do not just get to pull numbers from the sky. It takes time. And I think people don't always appreciate that because they just see maybe a number and an uncertainty interval at the end. But creating this type of information takes a long time. This is one of the areas that I think our project hit it out of the park. Because analysts trained on our project are continuing to use these methods, and they're continuing to train new analysts that we did not train between 2020 and 2022. So now there's a whole new team at the HEP in Colombia that does all this work. I don't know them. They do this without my help or without HRDAG's help. And I think that is one of the highest accolades we could have from this project is that real capacity strengthening. And finally, for all the follow-up we did, data publication, software, socialization, that is work, and it requires funding. So I think people think that when the Truth Commission shuts its doors, that's when the work ends. But what I would argue is actually that's when the work begins again. And all of this requires funding and resources. And for any funders in the room, I hope you don't forget that and you think of follow-on work to truth commissions as integral to the original work. With that, I will end. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Maria, thank you so much, especially for those final points. You've made some really relevant and important points and some take-home messages that I think will really resonate with many of us. As before, we're going to hold questions until the end. I did see a hand up from one of the other presenters, and I wanted to just make sure that everything is okay with our other presenters before I proceed. But I think that hand has gone down. Therefore, I am going to move over to our third presenter, which is Mr. Samson Omondi. And as I mentioned, Samson is the Assistant Director of the Kenya National Institute for Human Rights. And I'm going to share his slides on my screen now. And make them full screen. And Samson, as before, if you just let me know when you would like me to advance the slides, I will do so. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone can hear me. I'm happy to be with you this day, and happy Human Rights Day to all the colleagues working in this space. We salute you for the important work that you do in promoting and protecting human rights, particularly during this difficult period, I think, all over the world. So I'll go to the next screen, please. The next slide. And I've outlined my presentation into, I'll first speak about the establishment and mandate of our National Human Rights Institution. Then I'll speak to the origin of the collaboration and partnership that we have between Kenya National Commission on Human Rights and our National Statistical Office, and extend this with our other data producers. Then I'll speak about briefly about a memorandum of understanding between the NHRI and the NSO and other actors. Then I'll briefly speak about the institutionalization of the MOU. Then I will briefly describe some of the activities that we have implemented under the MOU and the impact of that on data and in terms of bringing voices that are not heard. And then finally, I'll speak about the impact of that partnership moving forward. Thank you. Next slide. So the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, as with other NHRIs, is established as a constitutional body under Article 59 of our Constitution, and consequently operationalized through the KNCHR Act 2011. Now, if you look at that act, it gives the Commission wide-ranging powers as pertains to promotion and protection of human rights. And all these powers are derived from Paris Principle, what we have in the constitutions, as well as other legislations. Now, in terms of membership, we have a chairperson and 4 members which are appointed in accordance with the Constitution. And I think this is important because the Constitution provides for the independence of the Commission. And I think that independence has given the Commission wide mandates to really do a lot of work when it comes to promotion and protection of human rights, as well as collaboration with other partners, both CSOs, government partners, as well as the development partners. And you'll find that as I present my presentation, there's a lot of work that we do a couple of partners that either promote, protect, and enhance the realization of human rights. Now, we have presence in 5 regions across the country, of course, besides the headquarters that we have in Nairobi. Now, the presence in 5 regions is necessitated by the fact that there are regions that have specific human rights issues. So these our regional offices help us to deal with specific human rights issues in those particular regions. So there are regions where there are issues that are more predominant are just ECOSOC rights. There are regions where we just have group rights being affected. There are regions where we have civil and political rights. So each of the regions have very specific human rights issues that they deal with. And I think through that, then we are able to widen our space and provide direction and move the country towards being a human rights state. Now, the mandate is to protect and promote human rights. And in doing this, we apply a couple of mechanisms. So we have complaints processing, we have investigations, we have research, we have public awareness, we have cooperation with partners, we have all those work that in one way or the other protect and promote human rights. And the Commission is the designated principal organ of the state in ensuring that we comply with national, regional, and international human rights. But I think it's also important to note that we have additional mandates that have been provided to us by other legislations. So if you look at one of the acts, Prevention of Torture Act, the Commission currently acts as the national preventive mechanism. Then if you go to CRPD Article 33(2), the Commission is the principal organ that is mandated to monitor the implementation of that act. Then in addition to that, the Commission also works with a couple of agencies within the country. So we sit in the National Council on Administration of Justice. We sit in the board of the Witness Protection Agency. We sit in the board of the Directorate of Public Prosecution and a couple of others. So those are state agencies. But in terms of non-state actors, then we also do a lot of work together that in one way or the other supports promotion and protection of human rights. Next slide. Now, our work in collaboration between our National Statistical Office began way back in 2016. And we based our argument on 5 main areas. That in 2015, we had the adoption of transforming our world to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, so SDG. And SDGs provided that there was need to ensure that we leave no one behind in the implementation of all these goals, as well as the 169 targets. But one of the conversations we kept having as a people working in this space is that as we speak about leaving no one behind, who are these groups that are left behind? But what is it that's required to ensure that we leave no one behind? And we came to the realization that there's need to ensure that we have credible data that is specific, that is actionable, that is both official and official, that we can always refer to from time to time when we make a decision in ensuring that we leave no one behind. Now, we took this and looked at it also together with our National Blueprint for Socioeconomic Development, which is a document known as 2030 Agenda. But also to ensure that national human rights institutions have a space in this, we looked at the Merida Declaration, which is very specific on the role of national human rights institutions in implementing the 2030 Agenda. Because if you look at the 2030 Agenda, there's a lot of, in terms of targets, in terms of the goals, and in the context of leaving no one behind, human rights play a very important role. So again, we based our argument on the Merida Declaration. And then finally, we looked at the 2030 Agenda in the context of the Kigali Declaration and the plan of action that had been developed to ensure that no one is left behind, as well as national human rights institutions have a very central role play in this. Next slide. Now, how did this collaboration begin? In 2017, under the auspices of the Office of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, that has been very instrumental in terms of building this partnership, whether it's in terms of providing technical support, financial resources, as well as advice from time to time. We held a consultation between the 3 institutions. So KNCHR, our National Statistical Office, which is the National Bureau of Statistics, and the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And the conversation at that point was, how can we look at areas of mutual interest so that we are able to push further in the context of dialogue on human rights and statistics, as we look at what are the roles and the responsibilities that a national statistical office plays when it comes to promotion and protection of human rights using data, as well as the role played by a national human rights institution in terms of collaborating with a national statistical office. And it's important to note that when we started these conversations, I think there was a lot of skepticism, and colleagues from national statistical offices kept asking, what does our role have to do with human rights? And we also have a few colleagues from the commission that will also ask, what does human rights have to do with data? I mean, we process complaints, we do research, we do this, and we think we do it right. But you are saying that if you look at when you want to promote and protect human rights, there's need to ensure that we have credible data. There's need to ensure that we bring everyone on board. But there's also need to ensure that as the country reports on its international obligation, the role played by the National Statistical Office, as well as the National Human Rights Institution, are very clear. And this initial consultation, we were greatly supported by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So we looked at this against what the Constitution provides as our roles and functions, but also mirrored it with the powers and functions of the National Statistical Office, which is the principal government agency for collecting, analyzing, disseminating statistical data. So if you look at that, then you find that there are areas where we'll naturally collaborate, because national human rights institutions, by the virtue of the work that they do, is that they generate data. So they generate data either from complaints processing, they generate data from research, they generate data from reporting for our international obligations. But we also, as national human rights institutions, work with other agencies, particularly non-state actors, that also generate a lot of data. And I think when we started the conversation, the skepticism was also arising from the fact that national statistical offices have very strict procedures when it comes to analysis of data, strict procedures when it comes to sharing of information, strict procedures when it comes to dissemination. But I think from the national human rights institutions, we were very clear that we would be able, arising out of this collaboration, to get a middle point where there would be advantages arising for a national statistical office in terms of engaging with us, and there will also be advantages arising from the national human rights institution engaging with the National Statistical Office. So we held the initial consultation first in 2017, and now arising out of that, we were able to develop an MOU. So please, to the next slide. So arising from that consultation, I think it's important to note that we were able to develop, just a slide before this. So arising from that consultation, we were able to develop, to identify total of 29 groups of people that were at the risk of being left behind. And our argument was, as you leave groups behind, then you are not able to promote and protect their human rights. You are not able to plan for them in terms of national development. You are not able to provide for them the necessary services that they need to ensure their well-being. And by the mere fact that we were able to identify these groups, it meant that when our National Statistical Office would be carrying out data, when they're carrying out data processing, when they'll be doing census, we'll be doing these surveys, then they'll be having very deliberate efforts to ensure that they get data from these groups, the 29 groups that were at the risk from being left behind. And it's important to note that we were able to sieve out these groups from the several treaty body concluding observation. So out of this, of course, we identified persons with disabilities, and within that, we go to the intersectionalities. We were able to identify victims of various, whether it's child labor, sexual and gender-based violence, FGM, street children, all these. And I think arising out of that, the initial consultation that led to development, identification of these 29 groups, then we were able to see that moving forward and agree with the National Bureau of Statistics that as you collect your data, then you must make very deliberate efforts to ensure that you get data for these particular groups. Then you must also make very deliberate efforts to work with institutions that have data from these particular groups, which you may not necessarily have. So these 29 groups, I think, have been very, of course, we've kept expanding the list based on more concluding observations. But I'm happy to report that there have been very deliberate efforts by our National Statistical Office to collect data from these particular groups, which they then use in programming, which is shared by a couple of shared with a couple of institutions that in one way or the other support promotion and protection of human rights. So the next step we went further was now to develop an MOU, which is the next slide. And the MOU identified roles and responsibilities of each of the institutions, both the National Bureau of Statistics as well as the National Commission on Human Rights. And the initial MOU was signed for 5 years, which was to run from 2017 to 2022. Then we've now signed another one, which is now running between 2022 until 2030, which coincides now with the 2030 agenda. And really, the gist of this is to ensure there's cooperation that promotes greater development using statistical information, working on policies and programs which impact on promotion and protection of human rights. And it's for both partners. And I think one of the agreements and one of the great things that have come out of this is that the National Statistical Office has come to really stamp their authority as that important institution when it comes to promotion and protection of human rights. And they have come to identify that the data that they generate, the data that they get from other partners, is useful when it comes to the role that they play when it comes to promotion and protection of human rights. So the first MOU, and I'll speak to the impacts of that MOU. The first MOU was implemented for the 5 years. We are now in the second phase, which will be elapsing in 2030. Next slide. Of course, that's the renewal, which we did on 27th June, and this will be running on until 2030. Next slide. Now, what are some of the ways through which we have ensured that we institutionalize this MOU? Number one is that there's appointment of focal points in each of the institutions. So National Commission on Human Rights and the National Bureau of Statistics have focal points that their work is to ensure that the objectives provided for under the MOU are implemented. Their work is to ensure that they keep records in terms of what has happened, what needs to be done, what was provided in the MOU, and that has not happened, and what are some of the things that we need to do continuously moving forward to ensure that the objectives of the MOU are met. Number two, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights has been included in national statistical committees. So particularly the committees that are relevant to our work. So we currently serve in the Peace, Justice and Security Committee. We serve in the Disability and Education Committee. We serve in the Gender Committee. And in those committees, we are able to bring in issues of human rights. We are able to bring in data that we get from other partners so that is included, and conversations that come from other partners that are not represented here are able to support the promotion and protection of human rights. Now, the other way through which we are institutionalizing MOU is that there's very good collaboration between the National Statistical Office, various UN agencies, whether it's UNICEF, whether it's UNDP, whether it's OHCHR, that is very particular focus on these partners working together. And the Commission has been the institution that midwives this process. And I think one of the things to note under this is the development of a contextualized methodology, particularly for SDG 1610.1. And we've been able to use that methodology to collect data that was published in the last VNR report, with the data being collected from both states and non-state actors, with the Commission playing really the major role in this. I think the other aspect to which we have institutionalized the MOU is there's increased regular consultation and involvement in activities of interest and expertise. That when Commission is doing out its research, for example, Commission can share tools with the National Statistical Office so that they are able to advise on what needs to be done to make the tools better. When the National Statistical Office is carrying out its some of its function, it's able to share some of the tools it has developed so that the Commission can look at the extent to which issues of human rights are well taken care of, to which issues of leaving no one behind are also well taken into consideration. Then we've also ensured that in the development of our strategic plans for the Commission 2018-2023 and 2020-2028, that aspects of the MOU are institutionalized in our strategic plan. So through that, programming does not become ad hoc. As we do programming, then we look at what is provided for in the MOU, and we ensure that we all move as a team. And I think finally, the other way is the Commission has been designated as the custodian of SDG 1610-1. And arising out of this, the Commission, of course, arising from the methodology that we developed, we've been able to collect data under this, working with a couple of both state and non-state actors, Independent Policy and Oversight Authority, National Police Service, and a couple of organizations that generate data under this indicator. With that information coming to the Commission, and then the Commission does the validation and shares with the National Statistical Office now for purposes of reporting and inclusion into the National Indicator Framework. Next slide. Now, arising out of this, there are those activities that we've been able to implement together. For example, we had the participation in the 2019 census. And it's important to note that when we did the 2019 census, arising out of the advocacy that had been done by the Commission, we were able to have intersex as a third sex marker, and which is currently recognized in Kenya. And there are a couple of legislative amendments which are being made to ensure that intersex are not left behind in terms of activities, in terms of programming, and in terms of promotion and protection of human rights. Now, the other activity that we've been able to participate in, and this ensures that no one is left behind, is the participation in the development of the yearly economic surveys. So we had 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. So the Commission is increasingly ensuring that the data that is required for promotion and protection of human rights is provided for as is required, which is then used by the National Statistical Office for purposes of sharing that with partners. Then with the development of a contextualized methodology for 1610-1 in Kenya, I think we are one of the few countries that's currently shares data under 1610-1, courtesy of the cooperation with our National Statistical Office, which focuses on human rights defenders, journalists, and associated media personnel. Then the designation of KNCHR as a custodian of SDG 1610-1. And then the recent one that we are undertaking is that we have just undertaken the development of the Defenders Report, which is a joint initiative that Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as a couple of partners were able to do an assessment on the extent to which laws, policies, and legislations impact on the work that is done by human rights defenders. And we've just finalized the first series of this for the year 2020, 2021, 2022. We are now looking forward to engaging in the next cycle, which will be for 2023, 2024, and 2025. And is a report that really uses data that is collected from partners that traditionally do not provide the data that they provide are from alternative sources. So next slide. I think the impact of that partnership, we have a census of first, which was the inclusion of intersex as a third sex marker, use of Washington group set of questions on disability, the inclusion of a group, the Makonde group, those that had traditionally been neglected But because of this advocacy, these are groups that had been left behind, the National Statistical Office was able to really see the importance of having all these groups. During that period, we currently have code for stateless persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. Then there's an ethnic code, which I think is also interesting in the context of living now and behind. There's an option which is provided for people that want to identify as Kenyans. Then arising out of this, we also had a enumerators manual that was developed in line with HRBA in terms of how to interview persons with disabilities, how to ensure that no one is left behind, how to collect data in a manner that protects and promotes human rights, and how to ensure that those that provide data is the data that they provide, they will eventually get back the information on what is done with this. So in terms of really bringing groups that are left behind, ensuring that we get the necessary statistics that are then used for purposes of promotion and protection of human rights, I think the cooperation between the National Statistical Office and National Human Rights Institution, bringing in other actors, because the Commission acts as this agency that brings in non-state fact actors that ideally would not engage with the National Statistical Office. And I think we've been very successful in ensuring that is done. Next slide. So the impact of partnership and other data producers that the Commission provides to the NSO contacts of CSOs on various thematic groups. Let's say if the NSO wants contacts of groups working with disability, those working with LGBTI community, those working on indigenous groups, the Commission from time to time will provide that information. And then the National Statistical Office will use that as whether they're carrying out census, survey, in ensuring that they get the information that is required. Then there's more structured capacity building of staff on statistics and human rights. Then we provide access to our National Statistical Office in our complaints database. And one of the things we are looking at moving forward is, if you look at the Commission processes a lot of complaints, and we are looking at a partnership where complaints processed by National Human Rights Institution, as well as other actors that promote and protect human rights, we can get this data into the yearly economic survey, so that we are able to have a feeling of what is the status of promotion and protection of human rights in that national document on the economic survey. And then the participation of the Commission in preparation of various reports of the National Statistical Office, like monographs on albinism, intersex data, and all that. Next one. Challenges. I think the second presenter spoke about a lot of interesting challenges. I think I will only add two. The issue of funding constraints for each parties, whether it's for the Commission, whether it's for the National Statistical Office, whether it's from other data producers, particularly non-state actors. There are a lot of funding constraints, and I think capacity gaps, that there's very little expertise on both human rights and data combined. So what that means is that there's a lot of struggle when it comes to getting the right thing to be done. So the issue of capacity gaps, I think, is one big one that requires a lot of thought around. I think finally, the last slide, I guess. So reflections, what would work better? Number one is the development of an action plan on MOU. And this is important because you need to agree on what will be done by who, when, how, where. So the issue of having a schedule of coordination calls, meetings, and all of that between National Statistical Office, National Human Rights Institutions, as well as other actors, particularly non-state actors, because non-state actors play a very important role when it comes to generation of data. Now, when you have an MOU that does not have an action plan, you get into problems when implementing it. Number two is the issue of strong institutional leadership, particularly at all the institutions. And I think for Kenya, we've been very lucky to have institutional leadership, particularly both from the National Statistical Office as well as the National Human Rights Institution that believes in this particular work. I think for ease of understanding, for ease of sharing information, there's really need for a strong institutional leadership. I think the other one is cooperation and co-option of partners beyond the traditional data partners. And you notice that there are a lot of institutions that are producing data at different levels, whether it's a CSO, whether it's an FBO, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a media organization. But there's really very little concentration in just a few of us. So can we look at cooperation and co-option beyond the traditional partners that we work with, particularly on generation of citizen-generated data? And as I speak about this, I make reference to the Copenhagen framework on citizen-generated data. And then the need for joint researches and involvement in activities for all the partners. And of course, in terms of dealing with issues of funding, can we ensure that there's joint fundraising for all the partners so that we are able to provide money required for resources as well as build capacities? And I think that should be the last slide.
Thank you so much,
that should be the-
Samson.
Great, thank you. And thank you for
Thank
listening
you.
to me.
That was an excellent presentation and raised many of the important points that we referred to in the introduction to this session. I'm going to move directly on to our last presenter. I would just like to get confirmation that she is now with us, and hopefully, yeah, Piedad, I see that you are now connected. I hope that you are able to share your slides from your end. Can you let us know if you're able to do that?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Hello. Thank you for having me here. No, I have no slides in this opportunity. I'm just going to provide a comment on this very important topic. I have been working on this my entire career since I did my PhD in demography, and my dissertation was on this topic. And now, as a general director of DANE, the National Institution for Statistics, for Official Statistics in Colombia, it's been really a privilege to be working on this topic. So I really appreciate you having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this very important conversation, as it brings together institutions across regions and sectors united by a shared commitment to advance in human rights through stronger data ecosystems. From our perspective as a National Statistical Office, data is more than a technical product. It is an essential public good. When produced with quality, integrity, and independence, data becomes a powerful tool to identify inequalities, to make invisible groups visible, and to strengthen the conditions for accountability and the fulfillment of human rights. As we enter the final stretch toward 2030, we must recognize the urgent need to strengthen our statistical system so they can meet the growing demand for granular, high quality, and timely information. National statistical offices are uniquely positioned to lead this effort. We have developed the governance frameworks, standards, and principles that not only warrant quality, but something increasingly rare today: trust. NSOs are trusted partners and should also serve as brokers of partnerships that enable evidence-based decisions and advance human rights through data. In Colombia, our commitment to collaboration is embedded in our national law and the production of official statistics, which emphasizes inclusion and confidentiality. Having modern legislation is a major achievement, but the real challenge lies in implementation. How do we build a dynamic and resilient statistical system? And how do we enable the participation of key actors who can help close human rights data gaps? The rise of new data sources from administrative records to citizen-generated data to mobile operator information offers meaningful opportunities. But without the willingness of all partners to work together, we risk maintaining the status quo and leaving many people behind. I really appreciate having learning from all of your experiences, insights, and lessons learned. But more importantly, I hope we can use this space to reflect on how together we can build data systems that are not only technically robust, but also human-centered, ethical, and resilient. Systems that protect rights, empower people, and ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Nice words, Piedad. And it's great that Colombia has been at the forefront of this work. This now brings us to the end of the 4 presentations. Thank you again to all 4 of you. And now the time comes to start opening up to the audience. Just before we do so, I'm going to put one more poll on the screen to see if you've been listening. Okay, as I mentioned, these are completely unscientific polls, but from what you've heard in today's presentations and from what you are familiar with in your own experience, which barriers most limit the production of usable, comparable, and trustworthy human rights metrics? Maybe all of them. You can check as many of these as you like. Are we most limited by absent, incomplete, or fragmented data on human rights topics? Lack of agreed methodologies? Limited mandates? Weak collaboration between stakeholders? Difficult for me to read them out when they keep jumping around on the screen. But I'm seeing interesting responses already that the main things that you're answering are absent, incomplete, or fragmented data and weak collaboration. Obviously, we know that all of these things are important, but it's just interesting to see that a majority of people find the actual data issues and the collaboration between different players to be super, super important in this space. So now we have around 15 minutes to open up for questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, those of you who are connected online can use the Q&A function. We do already have a few, so while you're thinking of your questions, we will start with the first few that have been received. And I'm just going to wait for those to load here. Okay, so we have a question for Maria to begin with, which is from a colleague, Mafisul Islam in UNMIS. He says, how do you implement a methodology that allows statistically estimated data with amputation to be published in a United Nations public report? In fact, he has 3 questions, so I'll read all 3 of them and you can pick and choose among them. How do you link and merge incident records from multiple open source feeds when the same event is described differently and the 5 Ws, so that was your when, where, what, and so on, are incomplete? What matching parameters work in this situation? And then lastly, a very simple question, is your tool open source? Before I give you the floor, I would just say, bearing in mind the different backgrounds of participants in the room, please do try to keep your answer non-technical. And if you have super technical responses, we could put you in touch directly. Over to you.
Thanks for those questions. Maybe I'll take them in reverse because I think they're easiest. Yes, it's open source. It's available online for free. You can use it if you want, but it's open source but highly specialized for the Colombia data. So it's not necessarily something I would recommend everyone download and play with, but it is there. Linking and merging. So I just want to clarify that my data might look a little differently than your data looks like. And the reason we work with people, so all the records that I told you about are records of people, is because it gets it gets away a little bit with some of the challenges of, for example, if one organization describes an airstrike and another organization describes an airstrike, they can differ both at the level of what they report about the airstrike, like what day it is or where exactly it occurred, and then also the people within it. So we work at the person level, and we use a statistical model to help us with the record linkage. This is the method we use. So there's no one field that lets us automatically know that two records refer to the same person. So instead we use similarity. So how similar are two records to one another? And we put that into a particular type of statistical model that then gives us a prediction of whether we think it's a match or not. And we use a lot of different fields to do that. So we use spatial information, temporal information. We would never publish this information. We have the names of the victims. So we generate a bunch of different comparisons of records, and then we put them into a model that allows us to do prediction. So I just want to clarify, particularly for the Colombia project, that this was not a project done alongside the UN. This was a project done with the Colombian Truth Commission and the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, so the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is a Colombian court legal mechanism. And basically what we did is we provided the technical appendix for the human rights chapter, and the commissioner, or rather not the commissioners, the commissioners rather, referenced our statistics in their reports. This type of methodology, a sort of older version, has been used in a number of different truth commissions. So in Guatemala, in Peru, and otherwise. And using estimates in official publications is not new. This has been happening, from time immemorial. And also choosing to report only documented victims is also a particular framework on what you think estimation looks like. So we treat it like a scientific project, and and the commissioners used the data in different ways, and it very much complemented. I think this is something really important. This big data project complemented a lot of qualitative work, and it is not and should not be treated as a replacement for qualitative work.
Thank you. Important points. I'd just like to ask if anybody in the room would like to pose a question to any of the presenters, or indeed to the community in general, the people who are connected online. Please, I'm going to put the microphone close to you, just so that people online can hear you.
Yes, thank you. I have a question that I can just, sorry, Felix Kirchmeier from the Geneva Human Rights Platform. A question that came up when Annie was presenting at the beginning, actually, about the citizens' data was for me the question of who owns the data and who can use it. The question comes from recent discussions around the whole smart cities movement, where actually a lot of so-called public data is used to develop AI applications that are then sold back to the communities. So for me, it's a little bit that question of, very often those who develop those very useful tools don't really think much about where the data comes from and who actually owned it initially. So I wonder, speaking about citizen data, if that's a discussion for you as well, because I hear you very well saying like how it's for whom we decided, like participatory with the community and so on. So I was wondering if you would have a comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's really the challenge. It is a challenging question. And at this point in time, we really do not have a very clear answer to that process, because citizen data at this point in India is at a very nascent state. And currently, what is happening is the data is in the custody of the organization that has worked to gather the data, and it has not been provided into the public data except with organizations that are part of it, and also with government institutions with whom we would like to present this data for taking the agenda of the communities forward. So this question of data privacy and public data is something that we still have to work around it. I would sort of say this is a question in the offing, and At this point, even with the UN in India, we are currently in discussion to see how such data can be protected and where does it finally reside and who can use it further. I would sort of say this is a question in progress and we still have not come to a final discussion on that point. Thank you for the question. I think it's really important.
Thank you, Annie. And I would agree. I think it is a super important question that has bearing on a whole lot of topics. And I know that there are some colleagues who are connected today who are representing the citizen data movement and have tackled these kind of questions at the level of all statistical topics. But I think when it comes to human rights, it brings a particular importance. Are there any other questions in the room? Nicolas.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask colleagues to pass the microphone in your direction, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all the presenters. I'm Nicolas Fazel from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And yeah, I think I really like the different presentation from the perspective of leaving no one behind and measuring things that are traditionally not being measured. I have two questions. The first one is for all presenters. From your perspectives, what are you think the main driver for ensuring the trust in the data that your respective institutions have produced? If you could elaborate on that. And the second one, I think we touch on what the last or really a comment made, but from the perspective of your institutions, AI, the use of AI, which is really on the top of the agenda of also those discussion at the RightX Summit. What has been your experience in your respective institution? Thank you.
I think since Annie is on screen, we can pass over to Annie first to offer your reflections on that question, and then we'll go to Maria afterwards.
I didn't really get the question. Can I just have the question again?
So the first question was about what are the main drivers for ensuring the trust in the data produced by your organization. What ensure trust, you think, in the heads of people when they see your data?
I think I would just agree with the first presenter that one is that some of the data that we have of the most marginalized communities are not gathered by the national statistical offices. And so since there is really no comparison that we can do with the data that we have with the National Statistical Office because that data is not available. So we would rather sort of look at this data as symbolic and in some way filling in certain information gaps that are there in the National Statistical Offices that can look forward to building policies and provisions for these communities. And in terms of the trust dimension of the data, I would sort of say that, a lot of care is taken to verify the information that is coming, to have the information vetted by the communities and their perspectives, to include statistical people in finalizing the questionnaire, the data. So all kinds of support is being taken, but much of it is from the non-state actors. Because at this point in time, unlike Kenya, we do not have a kind of an understanding or an agreement with our National Statistical Office for cooperation and collaboration at this point. That's something that is under discussion. So I would sort of say that at this point, the trust part is much more between the communities and the organizations that are part of the data collection and processes. And there is not so much data available of these communities in that particular context in the public space. So it's very difficult to sort of compare this data with the national systems of data available. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's where we are at this point. Over.
So, Maria, reflections on both trust and artificial intelligence. I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
Thank you. First on trust. So HRDAG is a group of scientists. And I really emphasize the scientist bit because what we do is science. We do not consider ourselves advocates, and we also don't consider ourselves activists. We work with our partners, some of whom consider themselves activists or advocates, but we are scientists. And that means we use often cutting edge scientific methods to answer questions of fact using, in our case, data and statistical methods. And for us, this is really helpful because I think the fact that we are really focused on getting the science right. And we do lots of things. So when possible, we might, for example, submit our work to an academic journal for peer review. We frequently, if we can't have formal peer review in that sense, we frequently organize informal peer review among our network of collaborators. And we work constantly with academics. You know, if I have a technical question, I phone a friend, and that friend is often a statistician, a practicing statistician, some of the people that develop our methods. And we are always constantly trying to do the best thing we can with the data we have. Sometimes isn't much. And I think just when you do that for several decades, that builds trust, especially if you are constantly working with communities and really doing this like outreach and socialization. What's our experience with AI? I think myself, comparing myself to the rest of the HRDAG team, sort of the most Luddite of all. I think AI has been really transformative for some of my colleagues' work. So for example, some of my colleagues have been using large language models to parse vast amounts of information that comes from PDFs from police departments. I mean, OCR software uses AI to detect characters. I think AI can do really transformative things when it is used to maybe do something at scale that a human can't do. So I am capable of reading through the police transcripts and pulling the information out. That's something like I as a human can do. And it is true that maybe an AI can do that faster than me. So that's potentially a good use of that. But what is really crucial, and what my colleagues will tell you, is really crucial to develop evaluation frameworks. How do we know that we're getting high quality information? How do we test that? How do we check that? And spending a lot of time on that. And again, I'm not, inherently pro or anti the use of AI. The question is, at the end of the day, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And is this the right tool? And if the answer is no, and we're just using the tool because it's AI, that's still not the right tool. And maybe we need to reevaluate what we're doing and why we're doing things.
Wonderful. An excellent mantra for sensible use of AI in the furtherance of human rights statistics. Colleagues, we have exactly 1 minute before we need to shepherd you downstairs for the final session of this afternoon. But I don't want to end without allowing you just one last opportunity to share using a poll. So from all of the things that we've heard about building partnerships, strengthening human rights statistics, I need you to pick 3, your favorite 3 from this list. Which of these are most needed to strengthen standardized official human rights metrics worldwide? They're all important. We've heard all of them mentioned during the 4 interventions, but which are your top 3 that you think need to be done? Develop and formalize common methodologies, strengthen formal cooperation, strengthen informal cooperation, increase investment in data skills. Now they're jumping around again. Build and enforce better safeguards, or improve communication and uptake of human rights metrics. And as I said at the beginning, this is obviously extremely unscientific and we are not a representative sample, but I still think it gives us some interesting food for thought. We realize that there is a need for investment in data skills. As we heard in the excellent presentation from Samson, there are people who speak human rights. There are people who speak data. There are not very many people who speak both of those two languages. I'm going to let you keep on voting on here. This is what we're going to call our action agenda for taking forward the work of human rights statistics. We're a small but dedicated team here in OHCHR, but we hope that we've now started the conversation to build a bit of a community who can share their thoughts and ideas with us. So with that, here's my final call to you. This here, and we will share this with you afterwards if you're in a rush to get away, is a place where you can share materials with us. If you have projects, if you have reports, if you have things that we should know about to help us improve human rights statistics, this is your place to send us either links or attached files, and we will share this with everybody who's participated today, including the full list of all the materials that are shared with us. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for your participation. I want to thank our presenters, Maria and Annie, as well as Pilar and Samson, who are no longer connected. And we will guide you downstairs to the final sessions of the afternoon. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.